Whether you're looking to build a website for your business, your hobby, your podcast, or just for fun, Pair Networks is your go-to web hosting partner. Not only do we have the lowest domain price in the industry, starting at just $11, we've got hundreds of stunning website templates to help you stand out from the crowd. You're not a techie? Not a problem. With our easy DIY site builders, you can launch your impressive website without any technical know-how. And when it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. Check out pair.com today to learn more. PAIR.com.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and I have another interview episode for you. This is coming from the recent International Agatha Christie Festival. You know, a large part of the joy of this festival is getting to meet up with luminaries within the field of Agatha Christie studies, Agathology, if you will. You have heard from a lot of those people on this podcast before, but you have not heard from the guest I had the privilege to interview in this episode. Let's just go right to the interview because I can't wait. You're going to love it. So one of the more significant perks of traveling to England to participate in the International Agatha Christie Festival is being able to meet my next guest in person. David Brawn has worked for over 35 years at HarperCollins here in the UK as a publisher. It is his happy task to handle all the Agatha Christie content that HarperCollins publishes, which he has been doing for 25 odd years now. This, of course, includes all of Agatha Christie's novels and short story collections, but also the Poirot continuation novels written by our mutual friend Sophie, as well as Marple, 12 New Mysteries. This is a new collection of short stories featuring Miss Marple, which just came out in the middle of September, written by contemporary authors such as Ruth Ware, Lucy Foley, Val McDermid, Kate Moss, among many others. I am so excited to talk about all of this. Welcome, David.
Hello, Kemper.
Very, very lovely to be able to do this in person across a table. It's very rare, actually, that I get to do any of these interviews in the same space as the person I'm talking to. So this really is a treat. And I appreciate you making the time during this busy festival that we were both attending. So I made reference to the fact that it's been 25 odd years since you've been working on Agatha Christie, but you had been working at HarperCollins before you started working on Agatha Christie material. So I'm just curious, how did that come about? How did you first start working on the Agatha Christie account? I don't know if that's what it's called, but that's what I'll go ahead and call it.
Yeah, well, I wanted to get into publishing like a lot of young people, and I had just graduated and was looking for my first job. And publishing is notoriously difficult to get into. And in fact, in the days before the internet, you would go to careers advisors at your university. And I was put off the idea of approaching publishers because they said, oh, you'll never get in. And in fact, the directories that listed job opportunities, famously, for me anyway, included entries such as, we do not welcome speculative inquiries, which was the line I found in one of these business books. So I had sort of given up on the idea of joining a publisher. And an opportunity came up at a publisher that was outside London called Thorson's, and they were a lifestyle and mind, body, spirit publisher. And I went in as a graduate trainee, as we would call them now, and I spent 2 years indexing cookery books, proofreading manuals on computing and
The literature you were passionate about, clearly. Yeah.
But it was a really good grounding in the sort of mechanics of publishing. And I still say to people, actually, you know, the skills that we bring to publishing are transferable within the industry. You can, you know, whether it's crime fiction or political biography, the techniques of putting a book together are very much the same wherever. And I had started to climb the ladder, if you like, and I worked across various lists. And it was a time of mergers and acquisitions within the publishing industry. And Thorson's, like many really very successful independent publishers started to get swallowed up by the big publishers, and they were bought by William Collins, and William Collins then merged with Harper and Row to form HarperCollins. And within 3 or 4 years, I found myself working for a major London publisher, which I had not anticipated. And in very short time, I was offered the opportunity to run what we called our estates lists, which at that time were principally Agatha Christie and J.R.R. Tolkien. And I said at the time, when I was offered the job, they obviously saw something in the way I worked. I said, well, I'm not really a fan. I had read Agatha Christie as a teenager, as we all did, but I felt a little bit inadequate in terms of my knowledge of the books themselves. And I was told actually that wasn't a problem. And in fact, it might be an asset, because in running a list for which there was almost no prospect for brand new publishing, this was a management role. And this was about being able to identify readers and to come up with ideas for new ways of marketing and publishing the books. And actually it fit me like a glove, I think, because here I am 27 years later, still essentially doing the same job.
Did you work on the Tolkien estate as well at that point? Yes,
I did. And in fact, at that time, Tolkien had been published by another independent publisher. At that time, it was Unwin Hyman, that had come from another merger between George Allen and Unwin, the original publishers, and Unwin's. They were also bought by Collins. And so, weirdly, we had two of the principal estates within the company, which had come from different routes, were being managed by the same person. They're both big estates. Both need some of the same skill set, even though in genre terms they were miles.
Couldn't be more different, yeah.
And the lady who was running the list retired early and very quickly because of a health issue. They suddenly needed someone to run these lists, and there were bolted onto that a few other estates, but none of which had the commercial potential of Agatha Christie or J.R.R. Tolkien. And Tolkien at that time. This was before Peter Jackson decided he wanted to make The Lord of the Rings. So it was very much a literary property, albeit a culty one, if you like.
Niche.
And Agatha Christie too, which at that time was sort of back in the sunlight, as it were, because we had very successful run of Miss Marple TV with Joan Hickson. David Suchet was still in the early years of recording Poirot. And with TV and film and any of those other media activities, there are excuses to sell more books to new people. So that was, it was all looking pretty healthy. And on the back of the Agatha Christie centenary only 5 years before, Agatha Christie was enjoying a bit of a renaissance, which hadn't always been the case. In the years following her death, the sales had followed a fairly traditional pattern. When an author dies, they had started to drop off. There was nothing new to regenerate the interest. I mean, people forget that by the mid-1980s, some of Agatha Christie's books weren't actually in print. They were beginning to drop out of print, and the publishers were looking for ways to regenerate those sales. And fortunately, the centenary gave them that opportunity.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because I think in 1995, despite the Joan Hickson series and the Suchet series, which really, now that we know how long it went on, was just getting started back then, even though it was 6 years on, it does feel like Agatha Christie was perceived in a different way, certainly from the way she is now. I think there's a different appreciation for quote unquote genre fiction, to the point where I almost feel the need to use air quotes, because I think people don't like the siloing of genre fiction into, shunting it into a corner versus quote unquote literary fiction. But I think that was still very much how people perceived Christie and Tolkien and anyone that wasn't literary fiction then, and probably still now. There are many people who still feel that way, but that does seem to be changing. And it's certainly something that we see here at, a festival like International Agatha Christie Festival, all the scholarly work that's going into treating Agatha Christie as a serious writer and using her work to explore all sorts of different aspects of the human condition in a way that I think someone probably from 1983 would have been like, huh? I'm curious, why do you think that has happened? Why has that changed? Or first of all, do you agree with me that it's changed? And then if you do, I'm just curious if you have any idea as to why. And perhaps it's due to your very efforts. I don't know.
Oh, it's all down to me.
It's all due to you, right?
Absolutely. No, if only that were true. In 1985, in fact, Collins embarked on something that was pretty unusual in publishing in those days, in that they commissioned some market research into the Agatha Christie audience. Now, market research was not a tool that was used in publishing. I mean, it was still very much a traditional industry. And the view was that if they were going to get the covers and things right and get the audience reading again, they really needed to understand what it was that audience wanted. And one of the findings from that research was that the covers were entirely inappropriate for the books themselves. They did not represent at that time in the UK or in paperback the experience that you would get from reading the book. And by the mid-1980s, popular fiction had moved from sort of men's thrillers being, the likes of Alistair MacLean and Desmond Bagley and Jack Higgins and some of these authors that were, these were the books that populated the bestseller lists. And certainly for Collins, who were very strong in that area. But also horror was a big draw for people. Authors like James Herbert were doing extremely well. And I remember talking to Tom Adams about his covers, and of course he did covers for Agatha Christie for the best part of 20 years, more. And he was sort of retired from doing Agatha Christie in the early 1980s. But he said even towards the end, when, some of his more gruesome covers were being painted, the spiders coming out of the tops of people's heads, eyeball sunsets or whatever.
Yes. Lots of eyeballs. The eyeballs always make me very,
and skulls. And I mean, and he said that at that time he remembers Mark Collins, one of the Collins family, was very much in charge of the fiction output at that time. And when he would send in cover roughs, it was like, no, more horror. We need more horror. Because these were the books that were sort of trending and popular.
In the 60s and 70s, right? That whole horror,
and into
Renaissance,
the 80s. And in fact, also you see that in the sort of pan editions of the books that were also coming out at around and slightly after Tom's. There was still, the skulls and the eyeballs were still very, very present. And this was the publisher trying to be fashionable in publishing terms and make the books look like what they thought people wanted to read.
Books that lots of people buy, yeah.
And what the research actually told them, and it seems obvious now that, the books about country house murders and colonels and old maids weren't delivering on the promise of the covers. There was a mismatch between what it looked like and what the reading was. And so this was probably not very clever if you're going to create a new audience. People who might like Agatha Christie might be put off by these ideas. And out of that came a decision to repackage in rather nice pastel coloured covers with what I would call an Art Deco font and some sort of mild artwork of artifacts and items from the books themselves. And a uniform edition was created in time for the centenary that was much more in keeping and had fewer shock tactics employed than the paperback covers that had been on those books for the previous 20 years.
Yeah.
And that seemed to work really, really well, along with the sort of publicity that the centenary afforded the publishing.
Right.
And the TV.
And the TV. And that is
coincided with it.
I mean, I did not expect that to be part of your answer at all. I mean, it makes sense, but it's just funny because in a way, thinking of those Tom Adams covers as taking away from sales or misdirecting readers it's just interesting because they've become so beloved because they are creepy and beautiful. But I completely understand what you mean, because I think as you're coming out of that 60s, 70s psychological horror craze, people who still want to read that material, well, if they're picking up that book because of that cover, they're not getting that for most of Agatha Christie. You know, maybe Endless Night, like that might be the only one that's like a little bit tonally in line with that. They're not getting it, and then the people that might want the Christie material aren't going to think that that book is, you know, the book that's going to satisfy them. So that's really interesting that repackaging them like that.
Dead birds and dead flies were, you know, obviously all the rage then.
Yeah,
I'm not saying that these covers weren't entirely appropriate for
that period,
that genre, that time. But certainly by the 1980s, fashions were changing, and the books needed to look different. And I mean, it's one of the things that amuses me as publisher, having been in the role for so long, is every time we do what we call a repackage of the books, and you know, we put a lot of thought into it. Quite often it is backed up even now by market research. We do some testing, see what is it that people want, who are the audiences we are trying to reach. And that's very difficult with Agatha Christie, because people of so many ages and backgrounds, and in terms of gender, but genders read them. It's very, very broad, and we have, you know, it's impossible to tailor something to everybody's taste. I still want 12-year-olds to be reading and enjoying Agatha Christie, and I want those books also to be relevant to people who are, you know, revisiting them in their retirement, and everybody in between. And so the covers are still one of the most important things that we do. But every time we do, as I say, one of these repackages, I sit back in my chair and think, well, they look great. These are the best they ever have looked, and I won't have to do that again.
Right.
And within 4 or 5 years, someone will tell me that actually these are looking a bit old-fashioned, isn't it? Time for a change.
Right.
In fact, we're doing the same now. So I can't think off the top of my head. I mean, it must be 4 times I've put new covers on all
of them. And when you do that, you do it for the canon. Like yeah.
And that is we all love Agatha Christie and the numbers of books that there were, but there are quite a lot of times when I wish that she had written half as many.
That she was just a little less productive. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's a unique problem. How do you create the perfect cover for a book that has almost universal appeal, that is going to appeal to a 12-year-old, a middle schooler in the US, and then a retiree in, say, I don't know, India or something? Like, it's just everyone. I mean, it's kind of an impossible task, but probably at least updating and refreshing off of the changing times and research is the best that you can do. But that's really interesting.
And I blame our forebears, you know, the publishers of 100 years ago, who would repackage books within months of publication and have multiple formats, the full-priced hardbacks and then the cheap editions, and they would recycle some cover designs and they would put new covers on. Now, if we were working in the music business, you know, the album cover becomes synonymous with an album, and it stays with you.
Don't have to change it,
forever. And you know, again, one of the things I sometimes wish for is, why couldn't we have that in publishing? This endless restlessness, this need to reinvent and to move the books forward. But that's what we do, and that has been a constant theme. This need to update, and you know, because we're trying the market moves, people's tastes differ, and we want the books to be on the shelves at the front of the store, not hidden at the back. And so there's this sort of dressing them up as new titles that happens a lot.
Plus now you have Instagram as well, right? So people love showcasing, oh, look at this new edition of Agatha Christie. I imagine that's important too.
It's massively important, and I gather so is TikTok, and I won't pretend to understand all of that.
Nor will I.
I'm of a generation that comes to this stuff a little bit more slowly than younger people. But these things are informing public tastes, and obviously influencers are very powerful. And so we're spending a lot of time trying to ensure that the messaging is right, and also it comes from the sources that will encourage people to read these books. I'm convinced that Agatha Christie's books are still rewarding for almost a universal readership. I mean, goodness, everyone on this podcast will know that, because you've looked in detail at, I think, pretty much every book and proved the point. But there is some anxiety as the publisher as to whether the books will carry on selling and being relevant. I think every year, if not every morning, I wake up, pleased that they're still selling. I mean, it wouldn't be impossible, looking at many, many other writers who have disappeared over the years, to contemplate the idea that, one day these books will stop selling because something else will have taken over.
Unthinkable.
But it's still the thing that worries us, and why we put such a lot of energy into keeping the brand leader at the front of the pack.
Well, this might end up then being a seamless segue into my next question, which is obviously the decision to create new content, to do Poirot continuation novels with Sophie, and now this Miss Marple collection of short stories. That was a big decision and a big change, and something that's fairly recent. Did the reason behind that have to do with marketing and keeping the books front and center, or was there another reason? And I'm just curious, why did it happen at the time that it did? Because, Christie had passed away for a while then, and I have to imagine that this was the idea of doing continuation novels that had been around and in the ether for a while. So I'm curious why it happened when it did happen.
I don't think it was a new idea. In fact, that would be supremely arrogant. In fact, I'm pretty sure that within months of Agatha's death, that it was being contemplated, but it was entirely unnecessary at that time. There were so many books, and she was so popular. And in fact, Agatha Christie Limited and Collins still managed a Christie for Christmas for 3 or 4 years after she died, with Sleeping Murder, with the autobiography.
And another collection of short stories, I think, right? Miss Marple's Final Cases.
Yeah. So there was for a little while still some new publishing to be had. And there were subsequent collections in Problem at Pellemse Bay. I mean, I remember the first meeting I had in 1995 with Brian Stone, who was at Hughes Massey and Agatha Christie's agent at a time when Rosalind Hicks was still alive. And I went along as a young, enthusiastic publishing tyke and suggested over lunch that I'd had this amazing original idea that obviously no one had thought of, because if they had, they'd have done it by now, which is, why don't you get someone else to write some Poirot and Miss Marple stories? And of course, he very quickly and gently put me back in my place and said, well, it's not something that Agatha Christie Limited would entertain. But of course, it had been considered, but Agatha's books were selling extremely well at that point, and it just didn't seem appropriate. And in fact, there wasn't the fashion for it then. There had been some, what do we call it, franchise publishing in the James Bond canon stuff, with Kingsley Amis in the late 60s. That was, I think, probably the only one of the big brands that was doing it. In fact, at that time, Booker Entertainment was the company that had shareholdings in both Agatha Christie and Ian Fleming. So, in fact, the Agatha Christie company was very familiar with this as a concept, and just didn't see any need for doing it. And we came up with a new short story collection, While the
Light Lasts. Yeah, I love that one.
That was an attempt to put together a new collection of stories, because I became aware fairly quickly, did some research, that there were 1 or 2 stories, not as many as I thought there might be, but enough to put a volume together. And
Tony Medawar edited that, didn't he?
Yes, he did. Tony was very useful in that regard, because he helped. Particularly, I think Manx Gold was something that I'm not sure even Agatha Christie's agent was aware of
its existence. Yeah,
but he had he'd made himself known as a fan to the company by that point, and so he was invited, to put into this, and Tony, what do you know that exists? And in fact, he volunteered to write some little introductions to contextualize each of the stories in the book. And we found 1 or 2 stories on lists that we thought would go into While the Light Lasts. There was one called The Mystery of the Dressing Case, and we were very excited that here was an Agatha Christie story that hadn't been published. And Brian then managed to track down a copy of it from a newspaper, and of course it turned out to be something else, Murder in the Mews, I think. And of course all those alternative titles. So we had a bit of a wild goose chase trying to find stories. But shortly after that, and the success that book brought, we were looking for new ideas, and novelizing the plays was the first.
Right, with Charles Osborne.
That's right. And Charles had volunteered his manuscript of the novelization of Black Coffee. So this thing sort of came ready-made. Brian presented it to me, and he said, this is a really good idea. And it was safe in that although we had another writer putting it together, this was essentially Agatha Christie's story, but it was probably too safe. And that and the 2 books that followed.
There's Spider's Web and The Unexpected Guest.
Yeah.
Those are
Yes, they have been novelized in a very safe way. He's essentially taken the dialogue and written some linking descriptive text, and then therefore relatively short. And they're not creative or artistic pieces. They're a solid novelization, but they don't have any real flair to them beyond what was in the play script themselves.
And that was around 2000, right?
That's right.
Came out.
And Charles actually did a draft of Verdict, which, without wanting to spoil anything, I don't think anybody dies in Verdict, or not under suspicious circumstances.
That's the play. I think it didn't do well because of that, right? Verdict by Agatha Christie sounds like, oh, well, we're getting witness for the prosecution or something similar, but it's very different from
you get to
that.
the end of the first act, and you shuffle out into the interval, and it's like, well, nobody's died yet.
Where's the body?
So we felt that actually that probably wasn't going to fly as a novelization, and it was probably the right time to stop doing these. There are obviously other plays that could have been done, and I guess might be done at some point in the future. But at that time, we thought actually we'd exhausted that. But Black Coffee, the first one, being a Poirot, was an enormous success. It was a New York Times bestseller. I think something like 350,000 hardbacks were sold.
Wow.
And a bestseller in the UK as well. And, we thought we were onto something really rather spectacular. The subsequent 2 books did not do as well. They're not Poirot, which, tells us a lot about some of the things that attract people to Christie. So we then well, we've done that. Let's see what else there is to do. And at that point, a new company had taken over Agatha Christie Limited. The Booker shareholding had passed to Corian, and Corian had big ambitions with the same directors who ran Agatha Christie Limited itself, but to bring Agatha Christie into the 21st century. And with that came Agatha Christie's Marple TV series with Geraldine McEwen initially. So there was TV activity. There was some very early on a bit of film activity with the Alfred Molina Orient Express, which, like it all did, was something new. The first time
it's definitely new.
Anything had happened for a while. And they also commissioned some more market research, quite a big piece of work into Agatha Christie and the books, but also the branding. There was no real branding style. That was when the signature was introduced.
Mm-hmm.
But what the research told us, and this was about 2001, was that generally people professed to be a bit embarrassed about reading Agatha Christie. Certainly if they were fans of modern crime writing, and this is before the golden age became fashionable again.
Yeah.
And in fact, we made a decision then to repackage the books again and make Agatha Christie's name look quite small on the covers, because people were saying in this research, I don't want to be seen sitting on a tube train or
reading an Agatha Christie.
Reading an Agatha Christie.
Oh, that's so
fact,
interesting.
If I love Agatha Christie, I might want to hide it behind my newspaper when I'm reading it.
Wow.
And so we came up with a very smart new look for the books, which was largely black, which a lot of crime books were at that point. The photographic, which was the first time in a long time we'd seen photographic covers on Christie, which felt more modern.
Mm-hmm.
Agatha Christie's name was a very small signature at the top of the cover, and the title was not very much bigger. And the sales went up, and collectively they looked very smart.
Mm-hmm.
But, you could read them surreptitiously. This was a guilty pleasure.
Were those covers just UK covers, the darker photographic ones? Because I don't ever remember seeing them. Because this is what, the early aughts about?
Yes, that's right. And this is, I'm talking specifically about publishing in the UK.
In the UK, yeah. So this is, because that's just interesting to me, because I'd never seen those. Not to bring up another huge estate at this point, but I still remember coming to England probably right around this time, just before Harry Potter reached absolute fever pitch, and I hadn't read any of them yet. And part of the reason I hadn't read any of them in the US is they look like children's books in the US. And I was in college at the time, so I probably didn't want to be caught dead reading a children's book. But I remember picking up the first couple of editions, because here they had like a photographic cover with a train on it, and it looked just like a regular book that an adult would buy. And I remember that actually did get me to buy the Harry Potter series, and then I was hooked. So I believe you that would work in that way.
Well, yes, Harry, and we all remember when Harry Potter was at its height, just how many people read them. I do remember remarking on a tube train journey in London to work one morning, looking down a carriage and seeing, I think, 7, let's call them grown men, reading what's
Harry Potter,
essentially a children's book, with a children's cover. And it was Bloomsbury, who published in the UK, came up with the idea. I don't know whether it was when the canon of books had been finished, or certainly towards the end, doing dual covers, doing sort of more grown-up covers to encourage older people to read them. But, dads were having to read them so they knew what their kids were going to be talking about.
Right.
It was such a cultural phenomenon.
Right.
And, there was a time when, that was true of a brand new Agatha Christie book. I think a new book would come out and everybody would read it. So those covers were very much UK covers, but we're talking about, 20 years ago, Agatha Christie had more than one publisher in the USA. So the list had been split between Berkeley, who were publishing, I think, the Poirots and the Marples, and St. Martin's Press, who were publishing the rest of the canon of Christie.
Oh, I never realized that. Okay.
So there wasn't a single publisher in the US. And this is not uncommon. Any author who writes over a period of time, can find that they change publishers over the years. And certainly in the old days, you would have different publishing house publishing in hardcover, to the paperback publisher. The licenses would be granted for paperbacks, which is how, in the very early days, you see Penguin Books publishing the first paperbacks of Agatha Christie's works, and then Pan Books in the UK. And certainly when I started managing Christie, there were these two publishers in the US, and there are disadvantages there, because there's always a little bit of nervousness if you're not an author's sole publisher. that you're going to put out marketing materials or have a campaign, and the other publisher, who is a business,
is going to benefit
and jump on your bandwagon. And also there's a nervousness about all your books looking the same. So certainly in the US at that time, there were at least two different looks to Agatha Christie.
I remember that. And then I remember the Berkeley was very distinctive. They had more of the Berkeleys would always have clues on the cover, sometimes quite spoilery clues, quite honestly. And they had a white sort of background and a very light look to them. And it was at St. Martin's, you said, that yes. They did all of the standalones then, essentially.
Yes, that's right. I think there had been some tidying up earlier on because, of course, in the old days, a lot of Agatha Christie's titles were completely different in the US as well. And certainly, I think in the 1990s, there had already been a move towards standardizing the titles, but there were, at that point, there were titles on the 450 from Paddington and in small type, also known as Mrs. McGillicuddy saw. That now has disappeared. Of course, those long-established US titles have disappeared from the covers, but for quite some time, in order not to mislead readers, there were these dual titles appearing on covers, and all of that a bit messy and a bit confusing for the consumer. But the long-term goal was towards a sort of global picture. And one of the things I have been fortunate enough to be around for was in 2010. Seeing HarperCollins acquire from Barclays and St. Martin's the rights to Agatha Christie in the US. For the first time, we have one publishing house globally publishing all the books.
Yes.
And that has allowed us to, consolidate a lot of the effort to unify the marketing. And although covers are still different on different sides of the pond, because tastes and fashions in publishing are different, there is more uniformity. But we can market Agatha Christie with confidence and knowing that people who get into her can collect, the whole canon of books. They can get to one place to buy the series.
Well, I'll tell you, while I've been reviewing all of Christie's books for this podcast, I actually made a point of buying the new US HarperCollins editions of each of them because I like the uniformity on my shelf. And what I also like about it, and this is going to sound like a backhanded compliment, but I think that the US HarperCollins covers are pretty plain. There's some sort of imagery on each of them that has to do with the title in some way. Like there's obviously a lot of thought put into them. And I think they're attractive, but they also aren't splashy or drawing attention to themselves. And I quite like that. I like that those books, and when they're on my shelf, it's very much about the text and not the covers. Because I myself am actually not as much of a bookstagram and sort of cover arty person. I can appreciate a good cover, and I love the Tom Adams covers, and I love the tradition of, I think, Agatha Christie covers down the decades, and then I can delight in them just as much as the next Christie fan. But I appreciate that the collection of books I have is very much just focused on the text. It's nice.
I'm quite particular about series, and I mean, if spines don't match, I get very annoyed. And I can't understand when I see on Instagram or someone will put up their photo of this is my Agatha Christie collection. And it's a ragbag of old and new and books that have come from all over the place. But of course, these books have sentimental value. You can look at you can identify where you bought those books. And others who, a bit like me, will, be tempted perhaps to buy a whole new collection if there's a new look that really appeals.
Yes.
And of course, it's difficult. Publishers are not interested particularly in encouraging people to buy second-hand copies.
Right.
I get a lot of inquiries about, how much do you think this is worth? I've got a Tom Adams. What do you think it's worth? Or can I get another one of these? And of course, no, but there's nothing new.
Right.
That's really.
Could I offer you this array of new?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, Morrow in the US, the imprint under which Agatha Christie now falls, have just created some gorgeous new covers for Miss Marple.
Yes, I saw that.
13 of them. And as soon as we saw them, we thought, these are fantastic. People are going to love them. But in the UK, we've done something different because we just felt that the floral covers, and they have clever things worked into the designs. There are weapons, and actually there's a silhouette of Miss Marple's face in each of those covers, which I'm not sure everybody's.
Oh, I did not know that.
But we thought they were too. They just didn't chime with what you would expect to see on a crime and mystery table in a bookstore in the UK.
Yeah,
and so we've gone for a completely different look, and it would be fantastic to come up with a look that would work globally. But it's very difficult because there are, booksellers have particular ideas about how these books should look. And in fact, if you cast your net wider and look internationally, in every country, there's almost a completely different look for Agatha Christie's books.
Yeah.
But it's fine. We do what's appropriate to appeal to the broadest possible audience in each market.
Yeah.
And if it dictates that they have to be different in both countries, then so be it. But I love what Poirot have done with Miss Marple. And I'm also very proud of what we've done here in the UK. We have some new candy-coloured covers with silhouettes, and behind them a new picture. And in fact, we've just published a wall calendar, very old-fashioned thing for everyone who has their digital planner, but a really lovely calendar with all of Bill Bragg's, who's the artist for the new Marple covers, all of his artwork, printed large. And in fact, we've been selling that for the first time at the Agatha Christie Festival this week, and it seems to be going down a storm.
Oh, I'm going to have to pick up one of those. Is it one Marple a month? Basically, it's like
yes,
that's perfect.
Yes, and there are 14. We have 12 novels, and
then in
the UK we have 2 books of short stories, which I think in the US have been consolidated into one volume.
Yes,
so we have 14, and we've managed to get all 14 of those artworks into the calendar. And it's a lovely thing. And of course, now we're scratching our heads and thinking we could be onto something here. What are we going to put in the calendar if we do one next year? So here's an exclusive. We're going to start repackaging Hercule Poirot early next year with a view to having a whole new look across Christie's books within the next 18 months.
Well, may I suggest The Labors of Hercules as calendar? 12 labors.
That's a good idea.
Right?
Thank you.
There you go. You heard it here first. It's time to talk BritBox, listeners. Why? Because this episode is sponsored by BritBox. But honestly, I am always willing to talk about BritBox because it means I get to talk about the best television for mystery lovers. Did you know that right now BritBox is running a She Wrote Murder campaign celebrating the greatest female mystery writers of all time? I mean, in my opinion, those would be the greatest mystery writers of all time, full stop. But why don't you check them out for yourself? Shows based on books by Agatha Christie, Anne Cleeves, Val McDermid, Kate London, and so many more. From familiar favorites like Poirot and Miss Marple to smash hits like Shetland, Vera, and The Tower, they are all on BritBox. And if you're listening to this in the US and Canada, you can get 50% off the first month of your monthly subscription when you go to BritBox.com and use coupon code Agatha. So don't delay. Act now. Supplies aren't running out, but the sooner you get to BritBox.com and use coupon code Agatha, the sooner you'll find yourself immersed in a warm and cleansing bath of British mystery. Alas, the crumpet-scented bath salts are sold separately. I promise I will get to the new content, which when I was asking David to very kindly give me his time, I think he probably assumed that was mainly what I was going to ask him about. But as usual, I'm getting stuck on all of this front material because it's so fascinating to me. But the other reason, I just have to say why I ended up using the HarperCollins US, their latest, or at that point, latest editions of the Christie novels, is that early on, I believe it was for Death in the Clouds, or it actually may have been Lord Edgware Dies. I used one of the Berkeley editions because it was at my parents' house. And I was like, oh, I won't buy that one because my parents have it. With apologies to you. That's what I said to myself. So I started reading it. And then because I have been doing this podcast with my late partner, Catherine and I were comparing notes before we started recording. And I realized that the Berkeley editions actually excised certain aspects of Christie's text. And we on the podcast call them the depictions stuck in their time that might, for a 21st century reader or a reader reading in whatever the present day happens to be, it might mar the read or strike them as offensive. These had to do with some anti-Semitic comments that were made by one character. The HarperCollins US editions, though, did not do any of those excisions. And I'm assuming that was a decision that had to be made. I'm just curious if you've ever been part of that decision-making process.
Well, when a publisher takes over an author's list, when the publishers change hands, there's not a lot of continuity, let's put it that way. So I'm not sure that the team at Morrow or us in the UK, I'm not sure that we were aware necessarily of what changes might have been made to the texts in the editions in the US over time. And I think if I remember rightly, for the sake of expediency, the US took the UK files for the books for their new editions in 2010, 2011, whatever that was.
When HarperCollins had acquired everything in the US.
The US. So if there had been work done on the Berkeley editions, for example, I'm not sure what happened to that. Now, in the UK, we're aware, of course, that Agatha Christie had been writing at a time when society was different to how it is now. And and she was also using techniques in her characterization to, highlight some of the bad characters. She might have put words into some of into their mouths, into their dialogue that she would never have used herself, but was a bit of a clue for readers that this was an unsavory person. And, there were things one could get away with then, or simply would go unnoticed or unchallenged, which in the 21st century we probably wouldn't. But I am aware, having gone through the books, one of the things we did probably nearly 20 years ago now was release a series of what we call facsimile editions, which were reprints, replicas of the first editions. And we became aware that there were subtle differences in the texts in those books between those books and the paperbacks. Because what has happened over the years, very gradually, and just as and when any instances occurred or any complaints were received, the odd word would be changed.
Oh, interesting.
And this happens, I think, in all publishing.
Sure.
And
little nips and tucks here and there between hardcover and paperback, essentially.
Well, yeah, and there are words that are changed because they might not be immediately comprehensible to a reader, 50 years later. Some jargon or a turn of phrase that 12-year-old might not understand, or their parents might not want them to be using themselves. So there have very gradually, and in a way that hasn't, I don't think, been catalogued, there have been odd changes of words over the years. And famously, of course, one book had its title changed completely in the UK. That has been an ongoing but rather organic process. And in fact, actually, one of the things that was also interesting when we published the facsimile hardback editions was that what we didn't realize that in republishing those, we were also reinstating mistakes or phrases that Agatha herself changed for the subsequent paperback edition. It's very rare that a book goes from hardback to paperback after a year or so, even now, when an author doesn't come in and make some changes or some corrections.
Yeah.
And so within a year of the book's originally being published, there might have been some changes. And some of those changes, we know that there were different chains of communication between Agatha and her agent and her American publisher to her British publisher. And so there may well, very early on, have been changes to those texts
Right.
that would have appeared in the Dodmead editions and subsequently
filtered on
through to Berkeley, through to St. Martin's.
Yeah.
That no one would ever have known about in the UK. So, these things have become subtly different. But I mean, I'm talking about the odd word here and there. We know more famously that there are 2 or 3 novels, I think,
that are substantially different.
3-act tragedy,
right?
Significant.
I think The Moving Finger is another one.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about just word changes. If there are differences between the paperbacks, you were perhaps reading as a youngster, and what you might find in an ebook or a paperback now, some of that will be simply because we have now used the British version of the book as the template for the American editions.
Right.
And so you'll find the occasional word maybe relating to conditions of disability or something that might have been changed simply out of respect for certain readers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So on new content, I am curious because you chose to do some new Poirots before this new Miss Marple. I was just going to ask you that question outright, but now in the context of our conversation, it sounds as though perhaps you chose to do Poirot first because of the success that you had with Black Coffee, in particular, with the Charles Osborne continuation. Was that part of the calculus of doing Poirot continuations first before Miss Marple, or did it just happen that way?
No, it wasn't as strategic as that. In fact, I think a lot of fans will know because it's Sophie Hannah has talked about this over the last nearly 10 years since the Monogram Murders was published.
Wow, that's crazy.
The idea came about sort of serendipitously in that her agent recommended Sophie to write a Poirot novel without asking her. HarperCollins in the UK had just embarked on a new series of Jane Austen reimaginings, up-to-date novels based on her 6 original novels, starting with Joanna Trollope and her version of Pride and Prejudice brought up to date. And I think I'm right in saying that her agent was the same agent as Sophie Hannah's. There was some crossover, maybe with that or with one of the subsequent books in that series. And so her agent said, I have an author who is an enormous fan of Agatha Christie, and I'm sure she'd love to do you a Poirot. And the editor for the Austen series came bouncing into me. She was a very bouncy person. And said, great news, the wonderful Sophie Hannah, who at that time was a bestseller in paperback after writing books such as Little Face. She wants to do a Poirot, and I sort of sighed and rolled my eyes and said, not another one, This was, not the first and certainly not going to be the last time someone said, let's do a continuation novel. Indeed, I had done exactly the same thing, Stone, 2 decades before. But remarkably, it coincided with a conversation that I had with Agatha Christie Limited, and we were looking at that time at the sort of sales trajectory of Agatha Christie, and we were admiring also what other lists were doing. And I mean, this is where James Bond comes into it again, because Sebastian Faulks had written his continuity book, Devil May Care, I think it was called, for James Bond, which was, I think at the time, the biggest hardback fiction novel that Penguin had published for quite some years. It was just remarkably successful, that combination of a popular author and a big brand. And at a time when, certainly in the UK, supermarkets were dominating the sales of books in large volumes. Amazon probably wasn't as well established as it is now. Obviously, 10 years ago, still a significant retailer of books, but there were other retail chains that would contribute to the success of anything. And the supermarkets did not and do not, as a rule, take what we call backlist. They're interested in new books. And we were a little bit concerned, again, we'd done a bit of market research, that we didn't think we were capturing as many new readers, those young readers, like people like me as a child who, we all defaulted to reading Agatha Christie. There was no YA. There were very few books written for a teenage sensibility. We would read, children's fiction. We would read Enid Blyton or Nancy Drew, and, you very quickly would move on to Agatha Christie because these books were relatively short, very, very well written, concise in their dialogue. Her vocabulary is not going to be off-putting, and there's no overt violence. So, there's some pretty brutal killings, but we don't get to see the blood in the text. And so parents would say, oh yeah, you want to read Agatha Christie? In fact, how many people do we hear who say, well, I was on holiday and my mum said, why don't you read one of these?
Yeah.
And that wasn't happening as much because thanks to J.K. Rowling and many others, Anthony Horowitz and Bond and these things, suddenly there were lots of other really good things to entice children away from reading Agatha Christie. And that was just one component of it. But I think I'm right in saying that there was a general feeling both at HarperCollins and perhaps at Agatha Christie Limited. And I can't really speak for them because they have their own conversations about what they want to do. But the conversation I had was basically it felt like it probably was the right time to explore doing a new book with another author. And this was literally the week after I had rolled my eyes at my editing colleague and went, we'll never get permission for that. So, so I come away from a conversation with, I think it was Matthew Pritchard and Hilary Strong at ACL, with the thought, oh, well, what are we going to do? And hey presto, Sophie Hannah's already in the mix.
Right.
We very quickly arranged a meeting, not knowing whether Sophie would end up being the person to write the book, or even if we would get a book at all. And her agent had spoken to her, and she did have an idea. She did have an idea for a novel she wanted to write, and a type of narrative that she said wouldn't work for one of her modern crime thrillers. And everybody met and got on like a house on fire, actually. It was a really good marriage of ideas in that meeting. And for me, I was saved what would have been a potentially awkward time of having to put together a short list of authors who might do it, approaching someone, and what if they turned us down? I don't know. It was just, Sophie was there, she had a great idea, she had a good track record, and she wanted to do a Poirot. And, so actually, to answer the question you asked me many minutes ago, why was it a Poirot and not a Marple? I think it was because Sophie said, I want to do a Poirot. Had she said she wanted to do a Marple, history might have been slightly different. But at that point, it was just we were toying with the idea of doing a new book. And I think we just coalesced around doing a Poirot. And it was an obvious thing to do.
Yeah.
Because the TV was still running, or had it just finished? Maybe it had just finished.
Finished in 2013, I believe.
Yeah, so I think it was at that time, that last series.
But even if it had finished, it was still fresh in everyone's mind, and there are more Poirots, of course.
Yeah, and so that that just came together really well.
Yeah.
And it was very much we were all determined this was a one-off. Let's see how it goes. Let's see if it does regenerate sales of Agatha Christie's own books. We weren't doing this for its own sake. The whole point of it, and the reason the discussion came about, was that we wanted a catalyst for reminding people that Agatha Christie's books and characters were worth reading. And actually, there are many people who are fans of Agatha Christie because they watch the TV versions. And because the TV had been going for so long, the people who called themselves fans, and they are fans, they're not disgracing them in any way.
Yeah.
but they're fans of the TV, and some of them probably, or not probably, they weren't even contemplating reading the books.
Yeah.
And we wanted a new reading experience that might tease them into, go on, well, actually read this, and if you like this, actually, hey, there are 80 more you can read.
Yeah.
And a new book by a new author would get us onto that shelf in the supermarket, and and just become a piece of dialogue. And Sophie Hannah was such a champion of Agatha Christie, and even now, whenever she does publicity for a new book, she doesn't talk about her book. She talks about Agatha Christie and how brilliant Agatha Christie was, and it's quite infectious.
Yes,
the whole
it
thing.
is. She's very persuasive in her passion for Agatha Christie.
And that's, and that's what has been so rewarding about it. And we have seen Agatha Christie's own books increase in sales and popularity as a result of publishing Sophie Hannah's Poirots. And, for me, I think for all of us, that was why we did it, and that's why we think it's a success, and that's why, in fact, it didn't end up just being one book. We did another one, and then we did another one, and Sophie, I'm very pleased to say, is about to deliver the manuscript for book number 5, which will be published in towards the end of 2023.
That's fantastic. Well, and you have now, of course, decided fairly recently to do a Miss Marple collection, which is recently out. It has been out for a couple of weeks. Obviously, the big difference here between what you did with Sophie and what you're doing with Miss Marple is that Sophie's Poirot continuation books are full-length novels, and this is a collection of short stories. So why did you decide to do a collection of short stories for Miss Marple and not start with a novel like you did with Poirot?
So we came to Miss Marple after, a few years of doing Poirot. And it would have been very obvious, I think, to do a new Marple novel probably immediately after The Monogram Murders was published. But we were on a roll with Poirot, and Poirot has been in the limelight for a while. And, what has added to that, of course, is Kenneth Branagh and his movies. And, we've been very much focusing on Poirot. It's been the popular strand of Agatha Christie for a little while. But we've also talked for a while about what and when would it be appropriate to do with Miss Marple, and could we do a chapter book series of young Miss Marple books, and all of those things are so a little bit more challenging, because we would be looking, if we were doing anything like that, at actually extending a character beyond the realms of what Agatha Christie did with her. And all that all felt a bit complicated. It's so easy to get these things wrong, and often, rather than get something wrong, it's actually easier not to do anything at all.
Right. No one gets mad if you don't do anything. Well, sort of. They don't get as mad usually.
No, and I work with many other estates as well. So these are conversations and anxieties that we have with many authors. This is not, Agatha Christie in this respect is not any different to most other estates or canons of work that have to be looked at. But when we were looking for new ideas and an idea, we thought, well, maybe it is time now to be looking at doing something with Miss Marple. The obvious thing would have been to find a writer and do a novel. I was a little bit concerned that if we took the new novelist, an established novelist, almost certainly we would find someone who knew their craft of writing. I was very aware when we first published Sophie Hannah, less so now, fortunately, but early on, there was a lot of vitriol directed at her for daring to, or presuming to write
her own Poirot.
This is Agatha Christie's character, and no one else should be writing for him. And Sophie was very clear that she was writing in the voice of Catchpole. She was mimic Agatha Christie's voice. She wasn't she wasn't doing pastiche. She was writing new stories with Agatha Christie's
characters or
favourite. I was going to say favourite character, but that would be debatable, of course, for all those Marple fans. And I was very aware that that if we subjected another author all on their own to doing this with Miss Marple and doing a novel, we could find all the good work that we have done in the best part of a decade, over a period when people have accepted that actually Sophie Hannah's Poirot books are perfectly fine. In fact, there are people who, really, really want the next one.
Yeah.
And they're always asking. And I thought, we're going to go back to everyone going, how dare they do this also to Miss Marple? And I had been rereading the books again. And I'd always liked the 13 Problems. And I don't quite know how it came about, but I just thought, why don't we do a new 13 Problems and have 13 authors, if it were to be 13, writing the stories, and then having, giving the book some sort of backbone that would link everything together, and enable a team of authors to bear the brunt of a fan backlash,
right.
if that were to happen,
or diffuse it entirely, because it's harder to be angry at a dozen people.
Well, exactly right. I mean, what we did know early on was that we didn't want, and actually Sophie didn't want to write Miss Marple.
Yes, she's been very clear about that.
And so we wanted somebody new, and I just thought, but also you in publishing you have to sign someone. I couldn't approach a best-selling author and ask them to write a Miss Marple novel on spec without making the commitment.
Right.
You have to sign them up. And what if they got it wrong?
Yeah.
What if they got the tone wrong?
Yeah.
Or and there are all sorts of things one can do in the edit, but it seemed really risky. And I think, one of the reasons it's taken us a little while to do anything with Miss Marple is that, we don't like to get things wrong. Of course, everybody does occasionally, but you want to take as much risk as you can out of it. And I just thought if we spread the load and if we were clever, we could do what Agatha Christie did in introducing Miss Marple. Introduced through the first 6 stories in the 13 Problems. Perhaps that was the way, and I suggested it at a sort of one of those catch-up meetings we have with Christie Limited, and everybody around the table went, we like that idea.
Yeah.
And so, David, who are you proposing to write it?
Where's this list of authors?
I had a few names that I thought, they'd be good for it. And I mean, there are authors in this book who, declared their love of Agatha Christie very publicly quite some time ago, and I knew that they would be some of the people I would want to approach.
Right.
But Agatha Christie has an international appeal, and, first thing we decided, we didn't just want middle-aged, middle-class, white, British or English authors, all writing stories set in St Mary Mead.
Right.
But actually, if you look at how agile Agatha Christie was in her plotting, and particularly with her short stories, we could actually, get some more diverse authors and viewpoints into this. We have seen Miss Marple in the Caribbean. So maybe we could take her to other places. And so we put together some pretty loose guidelines. The idea of the 13 Problems type backbone for the book very quickly went away. I scoped out a couple of ideas for a sort of structure in which Miss Marple would be in a setting, perhaps, in which she would be introduced to old friends or people she hadn't met before who would then want to share their stories, so like the 13 Problems.
With the dinner party setting, which is a bit limiting, quite honestly. I mean, Christie handles it beautifully, but it is, a limiting backbone, actually.
That's right. And it was, so it was, I thought we could do that, or we could have her off on some sort of research trip with Raymond, who might be writing a new book, and she'd go off with him to research it and uncover all these unsolved mysteries.
Right.
And we thought, no. If we're going to recruit some high caliber authors for this, they actually constraining them was not a good idea. Mm-hmm. And actually, let's just say, over that period, the sort of 1930 to 1970 period in which the Miss Marple stories and novels
Sure.
set, just write us what for you as an author is your most instinctive and cleverest short story that you can for Miss Marple, and and we would put them together, and as a celebration of Miss Marple and of Agatha Christie, actually perhaps show the flexibility of the format. Of course we want to see Miss Marple in St Mary Mead, but let's see her elsewhere. Let's see her mixing with other characters. So with just a few restrictions, we've ended up with a book that is set over in different time periods and with different characters, some familiar, some brand new, because we said to the authors, you can use any character or situation from the Miss Marple canon within your story if you would like, or by all means create your own. But we want to feel like the world of Miss Marple. Now, again, Sophie Hannah deliberately chose not to Hastings or George or any of the other characters. And that's worked fine in this because they're short stories, and because actually you don't have as much time to set up new characters or situations. An easy shorthand is to say to them, well, you can pull on some of these people. If you want Dolly Bantry, everybody knows who Dolly Bantry is. If you want to use her, then fine. But they have to come from Miss Marple's universe, not Poirot's universe. We don't want you meeting Poirot. We don't want any love interest or distractions. We don't want a young Miss Marple. We don't want the character before Christie consolidated Miss Marple's character, and we didn't really want anything set after Nemesis. And in fact, I think I know one of the stories in the book it clearly says early on it's 1970.
Yeah, it's right at the very end, right, of the sort of...
That's at the end of the period. And Val McDermid has written a direct sequel to The Murder at the Vicarage. She's called The Second Murder at the Vicarage, and it's also narrated by Reverend Clement, and it's the same. It's very much the same setup. You're straight there as though it's a follow-up chapter to that book, and that's obviously firmly 1930s.
Well, I have to say, and I'll do a more in-depth review and analysis of the collection in another episode. That's not what I want to do in this interview, but I think my favorite thing about the Marple collection is the fact that it doesn't have any sort of an organizing structure or backbone to it, because it's just wonderfully varied. I wouldn't have predicted that would be one of my major takeaways from reading this collection of short stories, but I felt like it was a great exercise in the notion of possibility. It's just revelatory almost, just to go from story to story, and as you begin the next one, think, ooh, well, what did this author who I know and who I've read before, what did they make of this assignment almost? And it's a little bit, in the best of ways, like going to a science fair and you see all the different projects and the different directions that people took it in. And I wasn't expecting to be as almost moved by it, actually, just because you can feel that there's this real delight in these authors being able to just create a Miss Marple story, and they just took it in so many different directions. And the overall feel, the sum is very much greater than its parts, actually, as you finish the collection, where you might not love every story. And I don't think anyone is going to love every story because they're so different. And you might think, I didn't like, where that one went, but that one went, completely opposite direction. It's a really interesting effect overall to have such variations among the short stories in a collection that are unified by this main character. And I didn't know that was what it was was going to be when I started reading, but I really loved the effect of it. And it really is the opposite of what Sophie Hannah did with Poirot. So that too, it's just you're kind of showing the spectrum of possibility that is available to an author when doing one of these continuation projects, actually, between what Sophie did and then what all of these authors did. And I really appreciated that as a reader, not just of Christie, but as a reader.
I'm delighted to hear that, because that's exactly what we were trying to achieve. And you know, I don't know how people will react to Miss Marple doing Tai Chi, for example. It's entirely consistent within the story that is being told.
Yes, it is.
I love the fact that after Lucy Foley's opening story, which is quite traditional,
yes,
and rightly so, and then we have Val McDermid's sequels. We wanted something very early.
I gasped when I realized that Leonard Clement was narrating the Val. I was like, oh my God, this is the best thing that is going to happen to me today. I was so excited.
So that's very reassuring. And then we get to story 3, and it's Alyssa Cole has Miss Marple dodging the traffic in New York.
Yes.
And it's like, wow, what is going on here?
Mm-hmm.
And there's an entirely logical explanation as to why she is there, and it's a beautifully written story she has a lot of fun with it in contrasting what Miss Marple would expect to encounter, for example, in a department store back at home in an American store. And that's just the colour of it, the flavour of it, before you even get to the mystery. It's such fun.
Yep.
And in fact, all the authors, what we insisted upon was that the authors had to be fans of Miss Marple, and that might go without saying, but when we researched them, when we approached them and invited them to write for the book, we had searched online, and we were looking for all of them. We had to find an interview or something where they said, "I love Agatha Christie. I read them as a child." Or we didn't just go, "Who are the most popular authors in the world? Let's invite them to do it." We wanted there to be a connection, and they've all had such fun.
They really did. You can feel that too. That's interesting that you looked for prior evidence rather than just also asking, because I would imagine that almost any author being asked would probably say, "Oh yeah, I'm a big Christie fan." Not that you wouldn't have believed them, but the best proof is that they would have, on some forum, either an interview or Twitter or something. Like I know, for example, Ruth Ware, it is very obvious when you go onto her Twitter feed that she is a huge Agatha Christie fan, and you can really feel that. I mean, just to give a sense, by the way, of the scope, beyond Leonard Clement, beyond Miss Marple on a cruise ship to Hong Kong, we find her in New York, we find her in Massachusetts. There's one story that's told in the first person present tense that has very much of a young adult feel to it, which I actually very much liked. But when I first started reading it, I was like, what? That's just a very, very, very odd for a Miss Marple story, but again, in the best of ways. And another one where the murder is actually of an author who's getting tired of a series-long character. It has a little bit of a flavor of Agatha Christie and Poirot in it, but Poirot himself is not in it, and that also goes in a very different direction. It has a very different, almost mysterious Mr. Quinn kind of tone to it. I appreciated that. Another one is set during Christmas, which is always welcome. Got to have at least one Christmas short story in there. So yeah, just there's so much going on, and also so many references. It's interesting that you told everyone that they could feel free to make as many references to the Marpleverse, which is what I'll call it, as possible, because I was going to ask you, did you actually solicit those references? Because by the end of the book, I think that almost every Miss Marple novel, and probably not every short story, but many of the Miss Marple short stories that Christie wrote were actually referenced. I mean, there are a ton of references to plot devices that happened in other Miss Marple novels, and also characters, big and small. We see Raymond West come up. We even see Cherry Baker, I think, is in one or two of them. Dolly Bantry appears in at least two, I believe. So they didn't have to make those references, but they were free to do so. That sounds like how it worked.
Yes, and I think it would be right to say that they all went back to the books and had a reread, familiarized themselves with the authors. I mean, we asked to see a synopsis for each story in advance, just to make sure they didn't all write a Christmas story,
Right.
or all
Yes.
jewel robbery or something. We wanted to make sure there was some variety, and I think interestingly, they were all varied enough for no one had to be sent back to write something else. But one curious thing I think is that 3 of the writers had a situation within their story where the supremely perspicacious Miss Marple spotted that somebody was pregnant before anybody else in the story. Mm-hmm. And 3 of the authors did that, and we had to ask 2 of them to change it. It's just, this big, it was like, oh, not another one.
Right.
We just couldn't get away with that 3 times.
Yeah.
But apart from that, very little in the way of changes had to be asked for of the writers.
Right.
They absolutely got it, ran with the theme, and and that was rewarding. It was a lot of work. It was like, and I didn't do it. My colleague and editor Anna Hervey at HarperCollins put all the work into herding these 12 cats, writing the stories. And I mean, some weeks I think it felt like we were publishing 12 novels, because they all had the same amount of attention as you would for a new book. So making sure they were all together, working out the order. We didn't establish the order in the book until after they were all written, because we didn't want 2 stories that were too similar next to one another.
Sure.
And as 2 of them are written in male voices in the first person. One, as you say, is written in the present tense. So we just wanted to make sure that the finished book was sufficiently mixed up in the stories that it delivered, and I was very, very pleased with the result.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's a smorgasbord of Miss Marple, and that seems to have been intended fully. Obviously, all of these authors, and there are 12 of them, right? There are 12 short stories
in the. I said something about 13 earlier. We thought about 13, but in the end, 12 seemed to fit the bill.
Yeah, well, it's funny, in the 13 Problems, the last one, that Death by Drowning, is a little bit of an outlier story that just kind of got tacked on. So, 12 is probably a better number anyway for collection. But these authors are all women. So I assume that was intentional on your part?
Well, okay, so it was obviously going to be really difficult to narrow down our cast of writers. And it just made it a lot easier to take 50% of the candidates off the table before we started. Because I knew if we wanted to celebrate Miss Marple and we wanted to celebrate Agatha Christie, and there's nothing to say that male writers can't and shouldn't do that. But it became obvious when we were shortlisting that there were more obvious female writers who would do this, who were sort of doing this sort of writing already, than there were perhaps men.
Sure.
A lot of crime fiction by men might be a bit harder or more thrillerish, and there were some clear candidates, who would be good at this. But I didn't want to get into a position where we had 1 or 2 in otherwise a book of female authors, and so early on it quite naturally turned into this idea that let's celebrate the most famous female writer and the most famous female detective with an all-female cast of writers.
Yeah.
And even as we were going through and checking, 1 or 2 writers turned us down, not because they didn't want to do it, but they were just too busy. If you're a popular best-selling author, you've probably got 2 or 3 books already lined up ahead
in the queue,
and are being shouted at for having missed your latest deadline. And you can't dash a short story off in a couple of weeks. It needs proper thought and time. And there were 1 or 2 authors who didn't have that time. So we had a sort of a short long list and got that down. And in the end, it was actually easier just to select from women. But what we haven't done, and I know that it therefore looks like, after having worked with Sophie Hannah and now we've got all women, that we're saying that only a woman can write for an Agatha Christie character. We're not saying that. We just haven't yet had the opportunity to bring a male writer in. But no, I didn't want one or two token male writers. I thought that would be wrong, and it has given us an extra marketing angle to say this is a book by only by women. But I wouldn't want people to think that it should only be read by women.
Right.
It's absolutely a book for everybody.
No, that's the great thing. I mean, it's honestly a strength of the book, I think, and there is kind of an elegance to it, as you said. Female writer, her best female creation, and then all these female writers doing the continuation of it, and then it's very obvious that there's a real attempt made within the collection to diversify the world of Miss Marple, even as to race, and that's something that doesn't really happen in Christie's books, or when it does in a Caribbean mystery, for instance, it may involve depictions that strike us as readers as stuck in their time. But in this book, we have lots of representations of people of color, and many of them created by authors who are themselves people of color. So I have to imagine that too was deliberate. And, I'm wondering if that was in some ways a reaction to that issue of depictions stuck in their time in Christie's work, or at least the perception of that issue, or if this was just something that you were generally interested in addressing or doing a good job on. Was there any sort of intentionality around that?
Well, in Christie's time, certainly the early years of Christie, there were no writers of colour, certainly writing in this genre. It would have been extremely difficult. Now, of course, there are so many writers of, rainbow-coloured writers being published, and so we had freedom to invite anybody to write the book. I mean, I think it's a strength of it to be able to put Miss Marple into situations that are characterised by authors with a broader experience. We wanted to take her abroad, for example. Jean Kwok writes the most amazing story of her on a cruise ship that brings in some really nice references that I'm not sure a Western writer would have thought of.
Absolutely, yeah.
And we'd seen Miss Marple in the Caribbean, and Dreda Say Mitchell plays on that a little bit by having Miss Bella as a sort of counterpart to Miss Marple. Yeah. It just seemed very natural to open up Miss Marple's world a little bit.
Absolutely.
And do that by having as broad a number of voices as we possibly could. I would have liked an author in here for whom perhaps English was not their first language. We did talk about working with some of the Agatha Christie publishers overseas to find perhaps a popular German crime writer or something. But then, working something back into English. We didn't give ourselves a lot of time, and we weren't familiar with authors, from other languages. I'd have liked an Australian or a New Zealand author as well. I think that we could have played a little bit with that. We satisfied our own brief, which is to have as much variety as possible in the book. I think what's interesting for me, and I mean, no decision has been made, and I don't want to promise or overpromise, but I think there is scope to do even more with this format, and I would love to do another book like this, and perhaps go a little bit broader, and to bring some men in and be able to play with the format, but. As we said when we published that standalone Sophie Hannah Poirot novel, let's wait and see how it goes before we embark on another one. There was a lot of work involved. It's been, I think, 3 years from having the original idea to actually publishing the book. And, it might take us 3 years to do another one, but I'd be up for the challenge, and I think I'd push that envelope even further than we have already.
I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, in that this book seems to be so much about possibility, you could always take that further. And it almost, when I finished it almost begs the question of, okay, now where next? You've already gone in so many surprising directions, but there's always a new one that you could go in. And it's just kind of breaking free of any of the restraint, I think, that perhaps we might have felt in an earlier time, and in a really productive and constructive way. I was just really inspired by it, actually. I really was. So that's great. I was going to ask you if there were more in the works. So let's hope, and who knows, if it goes well enough, maybe Parker Pine or Harley Quinn and Mr. Satterthwaite continuation series years in the future.
Well, that's interesting. Why not? I mean, I think, it's very tempting, as the public, given that the exercise is to try to encourage people to revisit Agatha Christie's own books. Those characters, although iconic, the fact that they only existed in one or two books, then it's much less obvious. I would be really interested in doing more with Tommy and Tuppence. Almost to rehabilitate Tommy and Tuppence. I know, they are perhaps two of the least popular Agatha Christie characters, and the 5 books they're in are very different. Of course, they age within them, but I think there's so much you could do with the two of them.
Absolutely.
At all sorts of times within their lives.
There are a lot of gaps to fill, right? I mean, that's if you're going to stick to the same rules, they span her entire career, and there are only 5 of them. So, yeah.
And it would, that would be really interesting. But it is, publishers tend to do the most obvious thing, and the most obvious thing with Agatha Christie is to focus on first Poirot and then Miss Marple.
Sure.
So we could certainly do other things. I don't know. There are. I don't think you're likely to see a situation where we're churning out new books based on Agatha Christie's work. There's no need to do that.
Absolutely.
Because there are plenty of books already, and new readers come to Agatha Christie all the time. I mean, I was saying earlier, that's, it's always a challenge. Am I going to wake up one morning and she stopped selling? Of course that's not going to happen. And in actual fact, people are discovering her all the time. And so we don't need too many catalysts, if we call them that. But I think the occasional new book is a good thing, and I like to sort of, I hope, delight and surprise people with them. So it'd be great to do something a little bit more unexpected, if you like.
Yeah.
Once we got Marple out of the way.
All right. Well, I end pretty much every interview with 2 questions. They're both very simple and don't really require long answers, even though they might not be easy to answer. But what is your favorite Agatha Christie novel?
It's usually the one I've just read.
Fair enough.
That's very corny, and I'm sure lots of people have said that.
It could be your favorite novel right now. The answer can always change. But in this moment...
I think my favourite Christie book at the moment isn't written by Christie. I think it's this book of Marple short stories. I've lived and breathed it for the last year.
You've been reading it. It's the last Christie you've read for a long time, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's a bit of a cheat, but let's stick with that.
All right, fair enough. And then my final question, gun to head, so you do have to make a choice: Poirot or Marple?
That's not difficult. It is Marple. I have always liked the Marple books. There are fewer of them, of course.
Sure.
But I think they're consistently a very strong series of books. And I like the way that actually Miss Marple tends to be more of an incidental character, if you like, to the stories than with Poirot, in that she sits on the sidelines a little bit more, and the detection is led by policemen probably more, and they're all different policemen, and they all write Miss Marple off and get her wrong. But I just think if I were rereading Christie as I do, if I'm doing it for fun, I tend to go back to the Marple books probably more readily than the Poirot.
Well, I love that answer because I am a Marpleite as well. So that is the correct answer. I actually love asking everyone the question because everyone has an answer, and the answer is always good and well supported because there are really good reasons to like Poirot and there are really good reasons to like Miss Marple, and people often have different reasons as well. So I like that. I know what you mean by her being a more incidental character. I think there's something often more organic and almost readerly if that makes sense, about the Miss Marple novels, whereas the Poirots truly are puzzles and often feel like puzzles, and that's exactly why a lot of people like them. And I like those too, but my affection, I think, really does lie with the Miss Marples, and that's part of the reason. Well, this has been a very long interview, and I really appreciate you taking all of this time, David, especially at the festival, and it was really just fascinating. And congratulations on this latest continuation collection, because I really did enjoy it. And I am very hopeful that everyone else is going to enjoy it as well. And I really do hope that there's more Marple material that will come out in the world, and perhaps some other surprises in the years to come.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again to David Brawn of HarperCollins for a fascinating interview. I was expecting to talk to David a lot about the new Miss Marple collection, and we did talk a lot about that. But the first half of the interview, in which he really deep dived as to the continuing problem of selling an ongoing catalog like Agatha Christie's after the author's death from the publisher's point of view, that was just really interesting. And I think he's one of very, very few people on this earth who has that perspective. And I'm so appreciative of the fact that he shared it with us. Apologies yet again on sound quality for this episode. It's nowhere near as abysmal as for my live episode, which I aired 2 weeks ago, but I do realize that it's not great. One of my big takeaways from the International Agatha Christie Festival is that I need to figure out a better way to conduct these roving episodes. So live and learn. I do intend for there to be more roving episodes in future. I also, by the way, just really loved the tidbit that there were 3 separate authors within the Miss Marple collection who had Miss Marple divining a pregnancy as an example of her observational prowess. Christie herself went to that well in The Murder at the Vicarage, actually, at the end of the story. I won't say who was pregnant. I wouldn't want to spoil that particular plot line in the novel. But I do understand the impulse. It's a very Miss Marple-ish thing to do, to know that someone is pregnant when no one else does, except for the pregnant person. So in a future episode, I am going to be conducting a state of the rankings now that the podcast's ranking grid is complete. But first, I am going to begin reviewing the final short story episode for each of Christie's major detectives. That would be everyone other than Tommy and Tuppence, and I apologize to Tommy and Tuppence and any Beresford heads that may be out there, but when I was keeping short stories in reserve for this very point in the podcast, when Catherine and I would be finished ranking all 66 of the novels, I wanted to keep one short story per detective in reserve, and I just kind of forgot about Tommy and Tuppence, so that pretty much says it all. But I have a Parker Pine, I have a Poirot, I have a Marple, and I also have a Quinn Satterthwaite story. And that is going to be the first of these final stories that I'm going to review, and that will be our next episode. The story in question is the Harlequin Tea Set. Very, very late short story of Christie's. In fact, I believe it is the final short story that she published, all the way in the 70s. Really can't wait to cover that. Mr. Quinn and Mr. Satterthwaite have always been a podcast favorite. Catherine loved them, I love them, and we shall delight in them one more time. If you would like to hear more from me, head on over to the podcast Patreon page, www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. That's Patreon, or you can just click on the link I've provided in the notes to this episode. October's offering is a review of the recent film release, See How They Run, starring Sam Rockwell and Saoirse Ronan and Adrian Brody. It takes place in 1953 at the Ambassador Theatre in London during the early period of the Mousetraps run. This is an extremely meta Agatha Christie-addled murder mystery film. I had so much fun watching it and almost as much fun reviewing it. So if you'd like to listen to my review, you can head on over to Patreon and subscribe. You can always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com, and you can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And I would really, really love it if you would give the podcast a rating and or a review. It's never too late. All right, see you next time. Bye.